The turkey was still steaming when my father set down his glass and stopped the whole table with one sentence. Forks paused midair. The gravy boat sat between us like a small brown lake nobody wanted to reach across. He looked at me from the head of the table, past my 6-year-old daughter, past the empty chair where my grandmother used to sit, and he said the thing our whole family had spent 30 years pretending not to think. My hands started to shake in my lap. But what none of them knew, what not one person at that table could have guessed, was that my grandmother had left me something in the hallway closet 6 weeks before she died. And once I opened it, this family was never going to get to go back to pretending again, where the quiet ones finally speak, and the truth outlasts the people who tried to bury it. If a family ever made you feel like you had to earn your own seat at the table, this story is for you. Drop a comment, and be sure to subscribe. "I'm done pretending she's my daughter," my father said. He said it plainly, the way you'd mentioned that it looked like snow, and that was the part that cut deepest. Not a shout, a verdict, handed down. The dining room went so quiet I could hear the furnace click on in the basement 2 floors below. My Aunt Carol froze with a spoon halfway to her mouth. My half-brother Bradley studied his plate like it held escape instructions. And I sat very still and felt the blood leave my fingers one knuckle at a time until my hands were cold and clumsy and useless in my lap. 34 years old. An emergency room nurse who had held dying strangers steady with 2 fingers and a calm voice. And I could not make my own hands stop trembling at my father's table. I looked at Ray Odell, my father, the man whose last name I had carried my entire life, and I waited for someone, anyone, to tell him he had gone too far. Nobody did. Nobody moved. And that silence told me something far worse than his words had. This was not a slip of the tongue. This was a thing they had all been circling for years. Tonight he had simply decided to say it out loud. "Mommy?" Rosie's small voice broke the silence. My daughter looked up at me with a smear of mashed potato on her chin, sensing the shift the way children always do, not understanding the words but feeling the temperature in the room drop 10 degrees. I put my hand flat on her back and made my voice soft and light. "It's okay, baby. The grown-ups are just being silly." I smiled at her, because that is what you do. You protect the small one first, always, before you let yourself feel anything. But inside, I was doing the arithmetic I had been doing my whole life. Ray had never been warm. Not once. Not at my kindergarten graduation. Not the night my mother died. Not when I put myself through nursing school on double shifts and no help from anyone. I had told myself he was just a hard man. A man of his time. A man who didn't know how to say the soft things out loud. I had built an entire childhood on that single excuse. But in 34 years, he had never once said any of the cold part in front of the whole family. Tonight was the first time the private cold became public. And some quiet part of me understood, watching Rosie chew, that a line had just been crossed that I was never going to be able to uncross. Here is the thing you should know about me before we go any further. I am the one who fixes things. Someone forgets to call the caterer, I call. Someone starts a fight at the reception, I smooth it over before the cake is cut. My whole life I had been this family's patch kit, the girl who learned early that if she was useful enough, quiet enough, good enough, then maybe the cold man at the head of the table would finally warm up an inch. I brought the pies every year. I hosted the holidays when Grandma got too sick to lift a roasting pan. I mailed the birthday cards he never opened and never mentioned. And the truly humiliating part, the part I am only now able to say out loud to you, is that even then, in the silence after he disowned me at his own table, I felt my mouth start to open to apologize. To him. My very first instinct, bone deep, was to say I'm sorry, to make it easier for everyone, to reach out and patch the exact hole he had just punched through me. I caught myself with the word already forming on my tongue, and for the first time in my entire life, I thought, very clearly, no, not tonight. Not ever again. "Maybe it's time we were all just honest," Bradley said, and he had the nerve to sound gentle about it. My half-brother, 5 years older, a man who had never once stood up for me at any table in his life. He folded his napkin into a neat square like he was closing a business deal. Carol let out a long, slow breath and looked up at the ceiling. The sigh of a woman who has been holding a lid on a boiling pot for decades and is tired in her bones. And I understood, slowly, sickeningly, that not a single person in that room was going to say the obvious thing. That you do not do this to your own child over cranberry sauce. That whatever the grievance was, it did not belong at a table with a sleeping grandchild down the hall. They were waiting. They were, God help me, relieved. Some old family secret had been pressing down on all of them for years, and Ray had just cracked the seal on it. And now they wanted the whole thing to pour out so they could finally set the weight down. I was the only person at that table who did not know what the secret even was. I had walked in that afternoon carrying 2 pies and absolutely no idea that I was the subject of a conversation everyone else had been having behind my back my entire life. And then, in the middle of the coldest moment of my life, I remembered the box. 6 weeks earlier, I had sat at my grandmother's hospital bedside while the machines counted down her last hours. Vera Odell, 81 years old, my father's mother, the only person in that entire family who had ever looked at me like I was already, completely enough. Near the very end, she had gripped my wrist with a strength I did not know she still had left in her. "There's a tin," she had whispered, pulling me close. "In the hall closet, top shelf, all the way back, behind the winter coats. Don't you open it to be nosy, Annie. Open it only when they make you doubt who you are." I had thought it was the morphine talking. A dying woman's riddle, a thread of memory come loose. I had kissed her forehead and squeezed her hand and let the words go, but sitting at that Thanksgiving table with my father's verdict still hanging in the cold air, her voice came back to me with a weight it had never carried before. My grandmother had known. Somehow, weeks before her own death, sick and fading, she had known this exact night was coming for me. "I'm going to get Rosie some water," I said, and I stood up before my legs could take a vote on it. My voice came out even and unremarkable. Years in the ER teach you how to sound calm, while your own pulse is a fist against your ribs. I walked into the kitchen, where the 2 pies I had made were cooling on the counter, and I gripped the edge of the sink until the cold porcelain steadied me, and my knuckles went white. Behind me, I could hear the low murmur start up in the dining room. The sound of a family finally talking about the thing, with the person absent, which is the only way cowards have ever talked about anything. I could have kept walking right then. Out the back door, into the November dark, into my car, and gone, all the way home, and never come back. Every single cell in my body was screaming at me to do exactly that. But you do not run from the one house on earth where your grandmother is still somehow watching over you. Not while there is one last thing of hers you have not opened yet. So I turned on the tap. I filled a glass with cold water for my daughter, and I made myself stay. The kitchen door swung open behind me, and I knew, from the heavy, deliberate weight of the footsteps, exactly who it was. Ray did not come in to apologize. Ray came in to manage me, the way he managed everything and everyone. "Don't you dare make a scene in there," he said, low, standing too close to my shoulder. "Your mother made enough of those to last this whole family a lifetime." And there it was. My mother. Dead 15 years, and he dragged her into the kitchen like a piece of evidence. He said her name the way you'd point at an old stain on a good tablecloth. My mother, Linda, who had raised me alone in the hard years before she got sick, who laughed with my grandmother in every old photograph in that house, who had never once in my hearing said a single bad word about the cold man now using her memory as a knife. I turned around slowly, the water glass still in my hand. "What did my mother ever actually do to you?" I asked him, quiet. And he didn't answer. He just looked at me with something on his face that was not anger. It took me a long second to name it, and when I finally did, my stomach dropped straight through the floor. It was fear. My father was afraid. "Why now, Dad?" I asked. I kept my voice low and level, the way you talk to a patient who might bolt off the table and hurt himself. 34 years. Why say it tonight of all nights? For a long moment I thought he would not answer me at all, that he would just turn and walk back to his kingdom at the head of the table. Then his jaw worked, And he said the thing that would send me straight to the closet. "Because your grandmother's gone," he said. "She's not here to lie for you anymore." He said it, and something crossed his face fast as a shadow over water, and then he turned and walked back toward the dining room without another word. I stood alone in that kitchen holding a glass of water for my daughter, and I heard the sentence over and over in my head. Lie for you, not protect you, not stand up for you, not love you. Lie for you. As if my grandmother had spent her whole long life covering up some crime, and the crime was me. Whatever the secret was, Vera had been the wall between me and it for 34 years. And now the wall was in the ground, and Ray had walked straight through the place where she used to stand. I brought Rosie her water. The table had that heavy, humming, guilty air of people who have been talking about you and stopped the second you walked back in. I set the glass down carefully in front of my daughter, and my eyes went, almost on their own, to the far end of the long room, the hallway, the closet, the top shelf, all the way back, behind the winter coats. And I know exactly what some of you are yelling at your screen right now. Walk away, Annie. Just take your kid and go. You don't owe these people one more minute. Believe me, I heard you. I have heard you every day since. But you do not walk away from the only grandmother who ever really saw you, not while there is still one last thing of hers you have not opened. So stay with me. Tell me down in the comments where you're watching from tonight, because what I found inside that little dented tin is not what a single one of us expected. I pulled my chair back in. I sat down. And somewhere between sitting down and picking up my fork, I decided. But not yet. I am a nurse. You do not rush the code. Before I opened anything, before I struck any matches, I needed to know exactly how far the rot had spread. I needed to know what they knew. All of them. These people who had sat across from me at holiday tables my entire life, while apparently holding a secret about my own blood in their back pockets. So I did the one thing I have always done best. I stayed calm. I stayed useful. I started clearing plates, stacking them the way I'd stacked them since I was tall enough to reach the counter. And I listened. Because a family that thinks the crisis has passed lets its guard down, and a woman carrying a tower of dirty dishes is completely invisible in her own childhood home. I gathered the gravy boat and the empty rolls basket and the good serving spoons, and I carried them slowly toward the kitchen, and I let my Aunt Carol trail along behind me. Because Carol had never once in her entire life been able to hold water in a cracked cup, and I already knew she would spill something the second we were alone. Carol cornered me by the dishwasher, twisting a dish towel in both hands until her knuckles went pale. "Honey," she said, and her eyes were already wet. "I hope you know none of this business is— people have wondered for years, that's all. It was never me spreading anything, I swear it." Wondered. For years. The word landed in my chest like a full serving tray dropped on a tile floor. "Wondered what, exactly, Carol?" I asked, keeping my hands busy scraping plates so she could not see them shake. She realized, one heartbeat too late, that she had already said far too much. Her hand flew to her mouth. "Oh, sweetheart," she breathed. "You really don't know, do you? You never knew." And that was the moment the whole floor of my life tilted sideways under my feet. I was not, it turned out, the victim of a single cruel outburst over dinner. I was the very last person in a room full of people to finally learn the true story of my own life. Everyone had wondered, for years, and not one of them in all that time had ever thought I deserved to be told. Bradley appeared in the kitchen doorway, drawn to a leaking secret the way he'd always been. He did not soften it. That was Bradley, top to bottom. "You want the actual truth, Annie? Fine. When I was 10 years old, I heard Dad and Grandpa out in the barn, arguing about whether they were even going to keep you, whether Linda's story added up. I was a kid. I didn't understand half of what they were saying." He shrugged, like it cost him nothing. "But everybody in this family has known there was a question hanging over you since before you could walk. Everybody. Known. The one single thing I had believed was solid ground under me, that I belonged to this family the way you belong to your own two hands, turned out to be a thing they had actually voted on when I was too small to know the vote was happening. Whether to keep you. Like a puppy from the shelter. Like something that came with a receipt. I set the last plate down on the counter very, very gently, because if I had not set it down gently, I would have thrown it clear across the room, and I have never in my life thrown anything at anyone. "Get out of the kitchen, Bradley," I said. And for once, he did. Alone at last, I let the pictures come. And here is the thing that truly undid me, standing there at my grandmother's counter. I had not imagined any of it. Not one moment. Every single birthday my father had been too busy to show up for. Every family photograph where I had somehow ended up at the very edge of the frame, half a step back and turned slightly away, as if the camera itself had known something I didn't. The Christmas he handed Bradley a hunting rifle with a bow on it, and handed me a card with a folded 20 inside, unsigned. For 30 years I had done the exhausting work of explaining all of it away, telling myself over and over that he was simply a hard man who loved in a language I couldn't read. He had not been simply hard. He had been holding me at arm's length on purpose, for a specific reason, for 3 decades, and the whole family had stood there and watched him do it, and quietly decided it was easier to look away than to say anything. I gripped the edge of the counter and let one single wave of it move all the way through me, from my scalp to my heels. Then I straightened up, because Rosie was in the next room, and I had a box to find. I ran the hot water over the plates just to have something to do with my hands, and the memories kept coming whether I wanted them or not. There was the summer I was 9, when I fell off the tire swing and split my chin open on the flagstone. My mother was at work. It was Ray who drove me to the little clinic in town, and I remember being so happy, so pathetically happy, that he was the one taking me, that for once I had him to myself. He didn't say a word to me the whole drive, not one. He signed the forms in the waiting room, and when the nurse asked if he was my father, he paused. Just for a second. Long enough that I felt it in my stomach even at 9 years old. Long enough that the nurse asked again. "Yes," he'd finally said. Flat. Like it cost him money. I'd spent 25 years telling myself I imagined that pause. Standing at my grandmother's sink, I understood I hadn't imagined a single thing. He'd been counting the cost of me since before I could tie my own shoes. Rosie was drooping in her chair, the way 6-year-olds do the moment the excitement burns off and the sugar crashes. I scooped her up and carried her down the hall to my grandmother's old bedroom, the one nobody had touched or even really entered since the funeral, and I laid her down on the quilt Vera had pieced together by hand a lifetime ago. The room still smelled exactly like her, dusting powder and cedar, and the faint sugary ghost of the hard butterscotch candies she'd always kept in a cut glass jar on the dresser. I sat on the edge of the bed and whispered out loud to a woman who was no longer there to answer me. "What did you leave me, Grandma? What did you know?" And there, on the nightstand, was a photograph I had seen 100 times and never once actually looked at. My grandmother and my mother, both of them young, both laughing, arms wrapped around each other on the front porch of this very house, not tolerating each other for the family's sake, loving each other, openly, easily. Vera and Linda had been close, closer maybe, than Vera had ever been with her own son. And I wondered, for the very first time in my life, what 2 women who loved each other that much might have quietly agreed, one afternoon, to protect together. A soft knock at the doorframe. It was Ray, and for one strange, disorienting moment his face looked almost young. "Can I sit?" he said, though it wasn't really a question, and he lowered himself into the chair by the window with the careful slowness of a man whose body had started to fail him. He looked at the small, sleeping shape of my daughter on the quilt, and something in him seemed to quietly buckle. "My father," he said, staring at the floor, "put my mother out of a room like this once. Christmas dinner. The whole family sitting there watching. Because somebody in town had started a rumor about her and the man who came to fix our fences that fall." He rubbed his whole face with both hands. "You don't know what that does to a man, Annie. To wonder. To sit in a church pew and feel every set of eyes wondering whether you're the fool of the county. It gets down inside you like rot in a beam. It doesn't come back out. And for half a second I felt it. The small boy he had once been, watching his own mother shamed and silenced at a table just like this one. For half a second I almost reached across the room for him. And then he stood up, and the softness closed over his face like ice, reforming on a pond in one cold breath, and the moment was gone. "This house is still mine on paper, Annie," he said, and just like that, the ice was back, and we were exactly where we'd started. "My mother, she talked a great deal at the end there, talked about leaving you things. This house, maybe. But talk isn't a deed, and a dying woman's wishes aren't a signature. So whatever you think you're owed under this roof, this table, these walls, that plot up the hill next to hers, you'd do very well to remember who it is that signs for all of it." The threat was so smooth and so quiet that it took me a full second to feel the blade inside it. He wasn't only disowning me as a daughter tonight. He was reminding me, in the same breath, that the house my grandmother had wanted me to have, the one inheritance in the world I had ever actually cared about, ran directly through his hands. Behave yourself, and maybe, make one scene, and never. He had taken the softness of a moment ago and turned it, right in front of me, into a lock on a door. And I understood then that whatever was waiting in that closet, opening it was going to cost me far more than my comfort. It might cost me the very last thing of Vera's I could still hope to hold. I stood in the hallway after Ray walked off and felt the trap of it close around me properly. Because the terrible thing was, he wasn't bluffing about the house. I knew that. My grandmother had talked, near the end, in that soft, urgent way of hers, about wanting me to have the place. But she'd been 81 and sick and exhausted, and she had never once gotten a lawyer out to the house to make it real on paper. I had meant to help her with it. I had meant to. But she'd taken a bad turn in October, and then there were the double shifts, and then there were no more Octobers. So the house belonged, cleanly and legally, to Ray, her only living son. And I understood exactly what he was offering me in that hallway. Silence in exchange for a roof, obedience in exchange for the porch swing, my mouth shut in exchange for the one place I loved. It was the same deal my grandmother had been offered 50 years ago. It was the same deal she'd taken, and it had cost her everything but the house. I stepped out into the hall and called Denise, my charge nurse, the one person on earth who had watched me hold myself together through the kind of shifts that break most people in half. I kept my voice down to a whisper against the phone. My father just disowned me at the dinner table, in front of every single person in the family. There was a silence on the line, and then Denise said the exact thing I needed and did not want to hear. "Annie, honey, you spend every single shift saving people who will never once think to thank you. You patch up the whole broken world with your bare hands, 12 hours at a stretch." A pause. "So save yourself tonight. Just this once. Let somebody else's house burn down without you running in after it." I stood in the dark hallway of my childhood home, phone pressed hard to my ear, and I felt the entire shape of my life quietly rearrange itself around those words. I had built my whole identity out of being the one who holds the pressure so nobody else has to bleed. But you cannot patch a wound that the other person keeps reopening on purpose, night after night, year after year. Some things are simply not yours to fix. I hung up the phone, and I turned to face the closet. The hall closet door stuck the way it had always stuck, swollen in its frame from 100 wet Ohio winters. I put my hand flat against the old painted wood and felt something almost absurd move through me. My grandmother's voice, clear as if she were standing right behind me in the dark hallway. "Open it only when they make you doubt who you are." Well, they had certainly managed that tonight, hadn't they? In the span of one dinner, they had made me doubt my father, my last name, my mother's memory, and the solid ground I had stood on every day of my 34 years. If there was ever going to be a night that qualified, if there was ever a moment Vera had built that whole strange instruction for, it was this one, right here, right now. So I braced my heel against the baseboard and I pulled. The door groaned open on its swollen hinge, and out came the smell of mothballs and old wool and my grandmother's own winter coat, still hanging exactly where she had left it, the left sleeve worn soft at the cuff where she'd always pushed it back to check the little watch on her wrist. I pushed the coats aside on their bar, one by one, a pair of galoshes lined up on the floor, an umbrella with one broken rib, a shoebox of tangled Christmas ornaments waiting for a December that Vera would never see. And there, on the very top shelf, pushed all the way to the back into the shadow, exactly where she had told me it would be, a small tin. It was the kind that had once held butter cookies, the sort somebody gives you at the holidays and you keep forever for buttons and thread. It was dented at one corner, the paint worn down to the faintest whisper of its old holiday red. My hand shook as I reached up for it. My whole life I had been reaching for things on high shelves in this house, always somehow half a step short of whatever it was I actually wanted. But this time my fingers closed around the cold metal on the very first try, sure and steady. I brought it down slowly, with both hands, the way you carry a thing when you cannot yet tell whether it is a gift or a bomb. And in that dim hallway, it was still much too soon to know which. It was far heavier than any tin of cookies had a right to be. It had never held cookies. My grandmother had left me something with real weight to it. I stepped back into the warmer light of the hall to see it properly, and that was when I finally saw the lid. The tin was cold in my hands, and my grandmother's handwriting was scratched right into the metal itself, pressed hard and deep with something sharp, cut letter by letter into the surface. For Annie, when they make you doubt. She had not simply left me a box. She had labeled it for this exact wound, this exact night, this exact knife. Not for Annie's wedding day. Not for Annie's 40th. For when they make you doubt. Because Vera Odell, sitting in a hospital bed 6 weeks before the end, sick and fading and running out of hours, had known with total certainty that a night would come when the people who shared my blood would look me dead in the eye across a table and tell me I was not theirs. She had reached forward across her own approaching death and handed me armor for a fight she would not live to see. I stood there in that hallway holding 40 years of my grandmother's foresight in two suddenly steady hands, and I stopped, entirely, being afraid of what was inside it. She had made this thing for me. Whatever it held, she had already decided I was strong enough to bear it. "There you are," Bradley's voice, behind me in the hall. He had come looking, and his eyes went straight to the tin in my hands, sharp and hungry. "So that's the thing the old woman kept going on about at the end, in the hospital." He held out his open hand toward me, palm up, like the box was already his by right. "Come on, let me see it. Whatever's in there, it's family business. All of it. And every one of us has got a stake in—" "No," I said. "Just that." He blinked at me, genuinely thrown. Because in this family, I did not ever say no. I was the yes. The "of course." The "don't worry, let me handle all of it." Bradley's outstretched hand hung there in the air between us, and I watched him openly recalculate, unsure what on earth to do with a version of his little sister that did not immediately fold and hand things over. "It has my name scratched on it, Bradley," I said, and I turned the lid so he could read it for himself. His jaw tightened hard. He wanted it badly, and that told me something crucial in itself. That every single person in this house had their own private reason to want to control what was inside this tin before I could ever see it. Which meant the last thing on earth I should do was open it alone, in a dim hallway, where it could so easily and quietly disappear forever. So I made a decision that the girl who dutifully brought the pies every year would never in 1,000 years have made. I was not going to open this thing in a corner and swallow whatever it held to keep the peace one more time. I had kept the peace my entire life. I had swallowed and softened and absorbed for 34 straight years, and keeping the peace had earned me exactly one thing. A father who disowned me over cold turkey, while an entire table of relatives sat nodding along like it was grace before the meal. Not this time. Whatever my grandmother had gone to the trouble of sealing away from me, of scratching my name into metal with a dying hand, they were all going to see it. In the light. At the very table where Ray had passed his verdict on me an hour before. If it burned the evening down to the studs, then fine. The evening was already ash and everyone at it knew. I tucked the tin against my chest with both arms, the exact way I held Rosie when she was small and feverish, and I turned and walked back down the hall toward the dining room. Behind me, I heard Bradley's footsteps, quick and light, going the other way to warn his father. Good. Let Ray have a few seconds to sit there and sweat. I carried the tin into the dining room and I set it down on the table, right in the middle of everything, next to the picked-over turkey and the gravy that had gone thick and cold in its boat. The low murmur died all at once. Every face at that table turned toward the small dented box with my grandmother's handwriting cut into the lid. And I watched my father. Ray Odell went the exact color of dishwater. He had been leaning back in his chair, the undisputed king of his table, master of the room, and the sight of that little tin straightened him up like a hook driven through his spine. His eyes locked onto it and would not move, and his hand, resting flat on the tablecloth, curled slowly and helplessly into a fist. Whatever my father had expected to come out of this night, it had not been this. He was not looking at me any more like a father who had been insulted by an ungrateful child. He was looking at that box, like a man watching someone strike a match right next to a thing he had personally doused in gasoline years ago, and prayed to God every night since that everyone had forgotten. My grandmother's dented cookie tin frightened Ray Odell more than anything I could ever have said to him, and I had not even opened it yet. And right there, that was the exact moment my hands finally stopped shaking. Funny, isn't it? How the body works. All night long my hands had been betraying me, trembling in my lap, fumbling the water glass, and the very second I set my grandmother's box down on that table and watched my father go pale to the lips, the trembling just stopped. Clean. Like a fever finally breaking in the small hours. If you have ever held something in your two hands that could burn your whole family straight to the ground and had to stand there and decide whether or not to strike the match, then you know that particular kind of quiet. It is not calm, it is the exact opposite of calm. It is every single nerve you own going still and cold at the same instant so that you can aim. Tell me down in the comments if you have ever stood in a room like that one, holding a match. Then stay right here with me, because I put my thumb up under that dented lid, and I opened my grandmother's box in front of every last one of them. The old hinge gave way with a soft metal sigh, the sound of something opening that had been closed a very long time. Inside, resting right on top, was a letter, folded neatly in quarters, my grandmother's careful looping cursive faintly visible through the thin paper. And beneath it, tucked flat against the very bottom of the tin, was a second envelope. Older. The paper gone the deep yellow-brown of something that had been hidden away in the dark for a great many years. Its flap had been sealed once, and then sealed again over the top with a strip of tape now gone brittle and amber with age. 2 documents, then. One my grandmother had plainly wanted me to read the moment I lifted the lid, and one that had been buried down there so long it had aged like an old bruise going from black to yellow at the edges. I lifted the letter out first, because that was the one she had set on top, the one she had meant for my eyes before anything else. Ray half rose out of his chair at the head of the table. "Annie," he said, and there was a warning under it. "Whatever that is." "Sit down, Dad," I said, quiet and even. And to my own genuine astonishment, my father sat back down. I unfolded my grandmother's letter and I read it out loud to the whole room, because I was finished, completely finished, with this family whispering things behind cupped hands. "My Annie," it began, and my voice caught on her name before it steadied. "If you are reading this, then they have finally said to your face the thing they have whispered behind your back your whole life, and I am no longer here to stand between you and it. Forgive me for that. I taught you to keep the peace, my girl, and I taught you wrong. I kept the peace in this family myself for 50 years. I swallowed things a woman should never have to swallow, all to keep a table set and a family name looking clean from the road, and all it ever did in the end was pass the swallowing down to you, like a set of dishes nobody wanted." I looked up from the page. Carol was crying openly now, one hand pressed flat to her chest, and I understood something in that instant that quietly rearranged my entire life. The thing I had hated most in myself, this bone-deep compulsion to fix and soften and absorb every blow so no one else would have to. It was not some private flaw I had been born with and failed to correct. It was an inheritance, handed down, woman to woman, in a family that had always, quietly, eaten its daughters to keep its men comfortable. I kept reading, my thumb holding my place on the trembling page. The night you were born, Annie, your father stood outside the delivery room door and would not come inside. Everyone in the waiting room said it was just nerves, first-time fear, and let it go. It was not nerves. Your mother had already told me, weeks before, what he had accused her of in private. And so I stood at that door and watched my own son choose his wounded pride over his wife's hand while she labored to bring you into the world alone. And so I made a decision that very night, in that hospital hallway. I did a thing to protect you, my girl. A thing I sealed away and hid, saving it for the day some man in this family would finally try to use a lie against you to your face. It is in this box, right underneath this very letter you are holding. I prayed every day for 30 years that you would never once need it. But your father has known the real truth for a very long time now, and I could not lie in my grave and let him quietly rewrite who you are after I was gone. I stopped reading. Every single eye in that room dropped to the second envelope, the old brown one, still lying there in the bottom of the tin. And Ray's chair scraped a slow, dragging inch backward across the hardwood floor. The room had not made a sound in a full minute. I could hear the candle wicks hiss. I turned the letter over, because there was writing on the back too, smaller, crowded into the margin like she'd run out of room and refused to stop. I know what you are thinking, Annie, it read, and my throat closed. Because she was right. She was reaching forward across her own death and answering the exact question forming in my chest. You are thinking, why didn't she just tell me while she was alive? I will tell you why. Because I was a coward. The same careful coward I raised you not to be and made you into anyway. I could keep the peace, or I could keep my granddaughter. And God help me, I chose the peace for far too long, because I was afraid of my own son. Do not be me. When you finish reading this, do the thing I never had the courage to do at that table. Stand up. I looked up from the page, straight at Ray, and I felt my spine go to iron. My grandmother had been afraid of him her whole life. I decided, right then, that I would not spend one more minute of mine being afraid of a frightened man. She was senile, Ray said, and he said it too fast and far too loud for a man who was in control. At the end there, you all saw her yourself, all of you, half out of her mind on those hospital drugs they had her on. And you're going to sit there and read a dying old woman's morphine fantasies out loud to a room full of people and call it the gospel truth? He was talking to the table now, not to me at all, working them, spreading his hands, doing the exact thing he had done to this family his entire life. But I was not listening to his words. I was watching his hands. Ray's hands were flat on the white tablecloth, and they were not steady, not even close. This was a man who had spent 34 years being perfectly, glacially, monstrously in control of every room he ever stood in. And now he was coming apart at his own Thanksgiving table one small, helpless tremor at a time. My grandmother, in her letter from beyond the grave, had been calm as a still pond at first light. My father, alive and unharmed and seated safely at the head of his own table, could not stop his own fingers from shaking against the linen. In the ER, we learn early to read the body underneath the words a person is saying, and Ray's body was screaming. Whatever waited in that second brown envelope, he was more afraid of it than of anything a dead woman could ever say about him. I found my place in the letter again, and I read the line my grandmother had so clearly built the whole long thing toward, the sentence the rest of it had been walking me carefully up to. Your father knows the truth. He has always known it. Ask him what he did the spring you turned 4 years old. The words dropped into that dining room like a stone into deep water, and every single head at the table turned toward Ray in one slow, unified motion, like a field of sunflowers all following the light at once. The spring I turned 4, some year in the mid-90s, a season of my own childhood I had absolutely no memory of, and apparently the exact hinge on which my entire life had silently turned. "Dad?" I said, and I set the letter down flat on the table. "What did you do the spring I turned 4?" He did not answer me. His mouth opened, and then it closed, and then it opened again, with nothing coming out. Bradley was staring hard at his father now too, and so was Carol, and so were the cousins down at the far end of the table. The whole crowd of people who had spent decades faithfully protecting Ray's version of every story was suddenly, for the first time in all those years, sitting silent and waiting to hear what Ray had actually, personally done. And here is the thing I have to tell you now, the thing that broke me clean open right there at that table, in front of all of them. My entire life, I had braced myself for one particular sentence. I had lain awake as a little girl in the dark and silently rehearsed how I would survive hearing it someday. "You're not really his. Your mother lied to everyone. You don't actually belong to any of us." I had built a suit of armor, plate by plate, against being the bastard, the mistake, the shameful secret smuggled in under a good name. So when I opened that letter, some part of me was finally, grimly ready to hear that exact thing at last and live through it. But the letter never said it. Not one single word of it was about whether I was his or not. Every line in it pointed the other direction entirely. At him, at what he had known, at what he had chosen to do about it. This was never, ever the story of what my mother might have done in some barn one summer. This was the story of what my father did, knowing the full truth the entire time. Ray shot to his feet so fast that his chair went over backward and cracked hard against the floor behind him. "That is enough!" he shouted, and his voice broke apart on it. And in that instant I understood, cold and clear all the way down. He was not afraid of being exposed as a cuckold in front of his family. He was afraid of being exposed as something much, much worse. Ray lunged across the table for the tin. He was frighteningly fast for a man of 64, and his hand closed hard on the near edge of it, and for one long, ugly second, the two of us were both gripping my grandmother's little box across the ruins of Thanksgiving dinner, the cold turkey between us, the guttering candles, my daughter asleep down the dark hall. Bradley surged up out of his own chair to help him. Of course he did, reaching over to pry my fingers loose from the metal one at a time, and then a body stepped in between us. Carol. My Aunt Carol, who had wrung dish towels and stared at ceilings and kept the peace right alongside me my whole entire life, put her soft arm flat and firm against Bradley's chest and said, in a voice I had never once heard come out of her in 34 years, "You will let her read it, Bradley. God forgive every one of us. We should have read it to that girl 20 years ago." Ray's hand went completely still on the edge of the tin. He turned and looked at his own sister like she had reached over and slapped him across the face. And in the small, stunned silence that followed, I felt the ground underneath this whole family shift for the very first time in my life. One person, finally, after all these years, standing squarely on my side of the table. I pulled the tin back toward me, and with it came the old brown envelope, and I held them both tight against my chest with one arm. The room had gone dead silent again. Ray stood there over his fallen chair, breathing hard through his nose, gray-faced. And I looked up at my father and I asked him one more time, and I kept my voice as level and quiet as two fingers laid against a wrist to find a pulse. "What did you do this spring I turned 4, Dad?" He said nothing. He could not. The man who had passed a plain, cold sentence on me barely 2 hours before, so sure of himself, so certain, now stood over a broken chair with his mouth working uselessly and not one single word coming out of it. And that silence was its own complete answer. Whatever the truth was, it was bad enough that Ray Odell, a man who never once flinched, never softened, never in my entire life said the words, "I'm sorry" to anyone, would rather stand there mute and gray in front of his whole assembled family than let me peel the brittle tape off one old envelope. So I made my choice. Right there. I shifted the tin to the crook of my arm, and I reached for the tape. "You open that," Ray said, and his voice cracked straight down the middle on the word. "And you are out of this house. Tonight. My name comes off you first thing tomorrow. My property, My roof, that plot up the hill next to your grandmother's. You will get none of it. Not 1 square foot. You will walk out of here with exactly nothing, do you hear me? And there it was, finally, laid out bare on the table right next to the gravy. He was not threatening me because I had shamed him in front of Carol and the cousins. He was bargaining with me, frantically. A man who disowns his own daughter out of pure wounded pride does not, 1 hour later, turn around and offer to quietly undisown her if she'll just, please, please, stop reading. He was trying, desperately, to buy that envelope back off me with the only currency he had left in the world: the house, the family name, the whole inheritance that Vera had wanted me to have. Which meant the paper in my hands was not, could not be, proof that I wasn't his. It was proof of something else entirely. Something he had spent my whole life making absolutely certain I would never find. He had started the rumor about me himself. Decades ago, he had planted the doubt on purpose, to cover up whatever that old brown envelope actually held. I stood there with the brittle edge of the tape caught under my thumbnail, and I did the math one final time, the way you triage a patient in the half-second before you decide where to cut first. If I opened this, I lost the house. The one with the porch swing that Vera and I had painted a robin's egg blue one long ago summer, the one single place on this whole earth where I had ever truly felt like I belonged to something. If I opened this, I lost the name I had carried for 34 years, the only name I had. And I lost the last thin, humiliating thread of hope I had quietly nursed since I was a little girl. The hope that someday, somehow, my father might finally look across a room at me and choose me on purpose. All of it, gone the very instant I peeled back that strip of tape. I looked down the dark hallway toward the bedroom where Rosie lay sleeping under her great-grandmother's hand-stitched quilt, and I thought hard about what, exactly, I would be teaching my daughter if I set this envelope back down, took the house, and kept the family peace one more silent time. I would be teaching her that a girl earns her seat at the table by staying quiet about what was done to her, and so I peeled back a corner of the tape. And still my thumb hovered over that tape, because losing the house was not even the worst of it, and I made myself look the worst of it dead in the face. The worst of it was that once I peeled this tape, I could never again be the daughter waiting to be chosen. That girl would be gone. For 34 years, some quiet corner of me had lived on the hope, small, starved, but alive, that one day the story would turn out to be a misunderstanding, that Ray was just wounded, just bad at love, and that someday he'd wake up and want me. Opening this envelope would kill that girl and her hope in the same second. Because if the truth was that he'd always known, then there was nothing to wait for anymore. There never had been. I would be trading a lifetime of hope for a single hard fact. And I understood, standing there, that hope built on a lie is the most expensive thing a person can own. I had paid for it for 34 years. I was done making the payments. I want you to hear one thing from me, Dad, before I open this. I stopped. The tape lifted halfway, and I looked directly at him, not with hate, because I found I did not have any of it left in me by then, but with a kind of terrible, final clarity. I am not opening this to hurt you. I know that's what you think I'm doing, because hurting people is the only way you have ever understood the world, but I don't want the house. I don't want to humiliate you in front of Carol and the cousins and your grandchildren. I'm opening this envelope for exactly one reason, and I want you to hear it. My voice did not rise. It did not need to rise. I need it so that I can finally stop asking myself why you couldn't love me. The whole room went utterly, breathlessly still, because every single person there had watched me silently ask that one question for 34 years, in 1,000 small, aching, wordless ways, at every birthday and every holiday and every funeral. And not one of them had ever, even once, heard me say it out loud. Ray's whole face collapsed inward, like a house with the center beam finally pulled out, and I pulled the tape the rest of the way off. The old envelope came open with a dry whisper of aging paper. Inside was a single document, folded once, official looking, printed on the heavy cream-colored stock that diagnostic laboratories used decades ago. The ink faded now to a soft sepia, but the words on it still perfectly, cruelly sharp. There was a date printed across the very top of the page, the spring I turned 4 years old. There was the name and address of a diagnostic laboratory 2 counties over, a place far enough away that nobody there would ever have known his face. And at the very bottom of the page, on a signature line, written in a slanting hand that I would have known anywhere on this earth, because it was the same hand that had signed every single card that ever disappointed me, was my father's name, Raymond Odell. He had signed for this. He had driven out there and ordered it and paid for it and signed his name to it. I did not read the result out loud yet. I just lifted my eyes slowly from the page and looked at him, and I watched my father, the man of stone, the man who never once flinched at anything, lower himself down into his righted chair like both his legs had been quietly cut out from under him. He already knew exactly what I was holding. He had always known. He had signed for it with his own hand 30 years ago. "This is a paternity test," I said, and my voice carried clean and steady to every corner of that silent room. "Ordered privately, 30 years ago. Paid for in cash, most likely, so there'd be no record. The spring I turned 4 years old." I held the old page up so the candlelight caught the faded ink, and everyone could see it was real. My father got in his truck one morning and he drove all the way out to a laboratory 2 counties over, a place where not one single soul knew his name, and he had my blood drawn and tested against his own. And then he folded up the result, and he brought it home, and he sealed it inside this envelope, and he never told one living soul on this earth what it said. Not his wife, not his mother, not me. Carol had both hands pressed flat over her mouth now. Bradley had gone completely white and quiet, every last trace of the smugness gone right out of him, and Ray sat slumped and gray in his chair, staring down at the tablecloth, a man watching 30 years of careful, patient silence come apart at the seams in front of the very people he had built the whole thing to protect him from. "So, do you want to tell them what it says, Dad?" I asked him softly. "Or should I go ahead and read it?" He did not answer. He could not answer. And so, in a warm dining room where the food had gone cold and the good candles had burned down to guttering nubs, I read my father's oldest secret out loud to his entire family. "Probability of paternity," I read, and my voice did not waver. 99.99%. I let it sit there in the air. I watched it move slowly across their faces, one after another, as each of them finished the same terrible arithmetic I had just done in my own head. "I am his daughter. This piece of paper says so in plain print, and it has said so since I was 4 years old." The whole room made a sound like everyone breathing out at the exact same moment, because they had all braced themselves for the opposite, hadn't they? Every one of them had half believed the whispered story, the old rumor about my mother, the question mark that had hung over my whole life. And here it was, in faded 30-year-old ink. I belonged. Completely and without question. There had never, not for one single day, been any real doubt. It was not, it turned out, a question of whether I was his. He had known that I was his since the spring I turned 4. He had simply decided, standing in his own kitchen holding this very piece of paper in his hands 30 years ago, that it was easier to go on doubting me than it would ever be to actually love me. He'd had the truth in his hand. And he had chosen the lie, because the lie let him off the hook, and the truth would have required him, every single day of my life, to be my father. The whole table turned as one to look at Ray. Bradley's face was a study in pure horror. The brother who had told me not 2 hours ago that the family used to argue about whether to keep me now understood all at once that the question had actually been answered in private before he was even old enough to have overheard it in the barn. Carol was weeping openly into both her hands, and my father, at long last, broke completely apart. "You were supposed to be his," he shouted, and his voice shattered on the word his, and with a sick lurch I realized he did not even mean me. He meant some idea, some phantom, some other man from 30 years gone. "Your mother," She swore to me. She swore up and down. But there was talk. There was always talk in this town, and I had to be sure. I had to know for certain. He gripped the edge of the table with both white-knuckled hands. And then it came back. It came back yours. Mine. And I thought, thank God. Thank God. And then I found that I couldn't ever unfeel the wondering. He looked up at me, absolutely wrecked, an old man in ruins. Every single time I looked at your face after that, I remembered doubting you, and I never once forgave you for a doubt that was mine. And there it was, at last. The whole rotten architecture of my entire childhood, confessed out loud over a cold turkey. And here, I need you to really understand this part, is exactly where I had a choice to make. I was holding in my two hands the one single thing on earth that could end Ray Odell in that little town. I could read the date at the top out loud again and let every relative in the room do the math on precisely how many years he had known. I could make him beg me. I could take the house. The deed ran through him, sure, but a whole room full of witnesses had just watched him try to buy my silence with it, and I have known enough lawyers off enough hard shifts to know any one of them would have wept with joy over that. I could win. Completely. Totally. The way, if I'm honest, some part of you has been quietly hoping I would win this whole time. I looked down at the faded paper in my hands, 30 years of proof that I was exactly, precisely who I had always been. And then I set it down. Gently. Flat on the table, right there next to the cold turkey and the guttered candles. You can keep the test, Dad, I said, quiet. And you can keep the house too. Every square foot of it. I don't want an inheritance from a man who needed a laboratory 2 counties over to tell him whether I was his. And I don't want a father I have to prove on paper. I'm not going to fight you for this house, Dad. I heard my own voice come out steady and almost gentle, and I understood, even as I said it, that I was saying goodbye to something I could never get back. You can have it. You can have the name too. The whole thing. I looked slowly around the long table at all the faces I had spent my entire life trying so hard to please. My grandmother's maiden name was Hartley, Vera Hartley, before she ever married into all of this. So I'm going to be Annie Hartley now, and so is Rosie. And saying it out loud, right there in that room, I felt 34 years of accumulated weight lift straight up off my chest all at once, like a wet coat finally taken off at the door. I had spent my whole life auditioning for a permanent seat at this table, patching this family's every crack with my own 2 hands and my own quiet body, dead certain that if I could just be good enough and useful enough and silent enough, they would finally let me belong. And the paper lying on the table in front of me proved that I had belonged all along, and that it had never once, not for a single day, actually been about me at all. It was never a thing I could have fixed by being better. It was his wound. And he had bled it out onto me my whole life, and I was finally, completely done carrying it for him. Ray found his feet again, and with them he found his last defense, the only real one he had ever had against anyone. You walk out that door, he said, low and shaking and desperate. And you are no daughter of mine. You hear me? No daughter of mine. He had said versions of that exact line to me my whole life, in 100 smaller ways. Once, even an hour ago, it would have leveled me flat. But now I just looked at him. This small, frightened, gray old man standing over a broken chair at the head of a cold table. And I felt something almost like pity move through me, and underneath the pity, unmistakably, something that felt like freedom. Blood never once made you my father, Dad, I said. You held the proof of it in your own 2 hands when I was 4 years old, and even that didn't make you my father. Walking away from you tonight, that is the very first thing in my whole life that makes me your granddaughter's mother. I picked my grandmother's letter up off the table, and I folded it back into quarters, and I left the test right there for him. Let him keep the proof. God knows he had earned every word of it. I walked down the dark hall and gathered Rosie up off of Vera's quilt, warm and heavy and boneless with sleep, her small arms going around my neck on pure instinct, even as she stayed under. She smelled like the powder and cedar of that room, like her great-grandmother, like the only part of that house I ever wanted to keep. Behind me, back in the dining room, I heard a chair push back from the table, then footsteps in the hall. I turned around, braced hard for Ray, for Bradley, for one more blade coming at me in the dark. It was Carol. She had her winter coat already over her arm, and her car keys clutched in her hand, and her chin lifted up in a way I had genuinely never seen on her in 34 years. "I'm not staying in there either," she said, her voice wobbling badly but holding, just holding. "I should have driven you home from a dinner like this 20 years ago, honey. I should have. So the least I can do now is follow you out the door." One person. In a house absolutely full of people who had chosen silence over me my entire life, one single person finally chose me instead. It was not the whole family. It was never, ever going to be the whole family. But it was Carol, standing there with her keys, and it was more than enough to walk out on. At the front door I stopped, with my sleeping daughter heavy on my shoulder, and I looked back one last time. The dining room glowed warm behind me, the low candlelight, the wreck of the turkey, my grandmother's forever empty chair, and my father, small and gray and folded in on himself at the head of a table that had been his whole kingdom his whole life, and was now, suddenly, just a room full of stunned people who had watched him fall. I was not triumphant. I want to be honest with you about that because that's the whole point. There was no rush of victory in my chest, no swelling music, no sweet, clean taste of revenge. My chest actually ached, deep and physical, like something had just been amputated out of me on that table, because something had. The hope of a father. Cut out clean, at last, after 34 years of infection. But underneath that ache, for the first time in my whole life, I found I could breathe all the way down to the very bottom of my lungs, loss and freedom, arriving together in the exact same single breath. I carried my daughter out through that door into the cold November dark, and I did not look back at that house again. The drive home was 40 minutes of empty Ohio highway, black harvested fields stretching out on both sides under a hard sky. Rosie sound asleep in her car seat, my grandmother's folded letter resting on my lap where I could reach down and feel the edge of it. There was no triumphant music playing. There never is any, in real life. Just the low, steady hum of the tires on cold asphalt and the sound of my own breath, still slowly, finally steadying, mile by mile. I had walked into that house a woman who fixed things, who held everyone's cracks together with her own hands, and I walked back out of it a woman carrying only what was actually true. Somewhere behind me, in a dining room going cold, my father sat with a piece of paper that proved I was his, and that he had known it all along. That was his to hold now, his alone. I had carried it more than long enough for the both of us. Ray never called. I did not expect that he would. Men like my father don't apologize. They simply wait, quiet and stubborn, for everyone around them to eventually agree to forget. Bradley went silent too, and chose the house and the name and the comfortable, convenient version of the family, exactly the way he always had. And the rumors in that little town did not vanish either. Small towns never once in their lives give a secret back. But the whispering was raised to Carrie now, not mine. Carol, though. Carol calls me every single Sunday afternoon without fail. She drove all the way up last month and sat right down on the floor of my little apartment building block towers with Rosie for 2 hours, and she told me long stories I had never heard about Vera and my mother. 2 women who had loved each other fiercely and tried, in the only quiet ways they knew how, to protect the one girl caught in the middle of all the family's proud, wounded men. It was not the family I had been born into. It was a smaller family, and a truer one, and I would take it, gladly, every single time. A few weeks later, Rosie found an old dented cookie tin at a churchyard sale, worn at one corner just like the other one, and she held it up to me with her eyes shining like she'd found buried treasure. So we made one of our own, the two of us. We lined the inside of it with a small scrap cut from Vera's quilt. "What do we put in it, Mommy?" she asked me, very serious about the whole thing, the way she gets about the important matters. And I thought about my grandmother, sick and fading in a hospital bed, scratching my name into cold metal with something sharp so that she could arm me from across her own grave. "Only the true things," I told my daughter. "That's the whole entire rule for this box. Whatever we put in here, it has to be true." She nodded like that made perfect and complete sense, because to a 6-year-old, of course it does. She put in a pine cone and a crayon drawing of the two of us holding hands, and I put in Vera's letter, folded in its careful quarters. And then we closed the lid together on a box that would never, not once for as long as I lived, hold a single lie. A father is not the man whose blood you happen to carry. He is the person who never once, not in your whole life, made you audition for a seat at the table. The turkey went cold. The house stayed his. And the only thing in that whole place that ever truly mattered came home with me, asleep in the back seat. If you have ever set the proof down, left it lying right there on the table, and walked toward yourself instead of toward the fight, then you already know exactly how this story ends. Subscribe if that's you. Leave a comment with the one word you needed to say and never did, and I'll see you at the next table.